Hey guys, welcome back to my channel, and if you're new to my channel, hello. My name is Caitlin Elliott, and happy Friday. So, I post true crime cases on Tuesdays and Fridays, with my more vintage cases being on Fridays. So if this is something that interests you, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and turn on your notification bell so that you never miss any of my uploads. So in my last video, we actually discussed the unsolved serial killings of the alphabet murders. Remember the alphabet murders? They were the ones with the girls whose names were started with the same first and last name started with the same letter. So we're going to be discussing in this video one of the youngest killers in the country of England, and this is the case of Mary Bell. In the year of 1968, there was an 11-year-old girl who actually brutally murdered two young boys in the neighborhood of Scotswood, England, which prompted an enormous cry to society. So Scotswood is a village in England, and it is said to have not really changed much since the London Blitz during World War II. After the war ended, a large amount of low-income families ended up moving into the area and started to settle in. So a majority of these families that did move in there were said to have been alcoholics, and this included the same family that Mary Bell was to grow up in. So, Mary Flora Bell was born on May 26th of 1957. Mary was said to have grown up in a very rough suburb of Newcastle upon Tyne, and this was where every other home in the neighborhood actually had a working prostitute inside. It was just extremely difficult to find any type of good people in the town because it just seems like there was just so much crime and so much violence riddled in the area. Children struggled from day to day, and it just was a time where some children couldn't even afford to eat, so there was a lot of starving children. Mary Bell's childhood was certainly not the best, and it said that she was neglected a lot by her parents. Her parents were never in love, and they never wanted a child, so when she was born, they realized that she was just too much work, and they didn't want to have to take care of her, so they often would plan vacations and travel around and would leave her to herself in this house when she was like 6 or 7 years old. So what's even worse about this is that the Bell family is said to have lived on White House Road, which was considered at the time to be the roughest part of town. So Mary's mother, Betty, was said to be extremely depressive and have an extremely erratic personality. So she would be happy one minute and then sad the next, and just would flip like a switch. At one point, Betty actually tried to put Mary up for adoption, and then when a family contacted her and said that they wanted to adopt Mary, she freaked out and wouldn't let anyone take care of Mary but herself. So during this time, Betty was said to have been considered the lady of the night, which is basically another word for prostitution. And Mary was often left home alone while her mother would go out and be with these male clients, if you will, and just leave her alone. And it was just so awful. So her father's name was William, but he went by Billy Bell, and he was a criminal and a drunk. He was well known to the local authorities because of his violent behavior, and would often try to rape other women while intoxicated. Billy was definitely not the type of guy that you would want to be around with, especially at night, because he was the one that could stalk his victims, creep up on them, and then have his way with them, if you will. Because of this, Mary had like no chance in hell of being raised normally. At school, Mary was said to have a very disturbing behavior pattern on the playground. It's said that she would often keep to herself and just stand around and just stare at each of her classmates with these piercing blue eyes that just seemed like they've seen too much. So when Mary would play with her classmates, she would be said to have been just happy and fine and cheerful one minute, and then like flip like a switch, and she'll just be aggressive and angry the next. So her own teachers at the schoolyard became aware pretty quickly that Mary Bell had a very sadistic streak towards her classmates. There was actually one day where a student had walked in from recess and was crying and sobbing hysterically with a mark on their face. So the teacher was obviously concerned that something had to have happened. I mean, how does a child get a mark on their face like that? So when the teacher asked the child why she was crying, she said that Mary had pinned her down on the ground and stomped out a lit cigarette on her face. I mean, oh my God. So when the teacher asks Mary, like, did you do this to this child? Did you pin down Susie and then stomp out a lit cigarette on her face? She's like, yeah, it was me. Wow. So even though Mary's teachers were said to have noticed her aggressive behavior, no one seemed to do anything to try to help her. It really seemed that no one really cared about the poor girl, and no one wanted to see her succeed in life, and no one wanted to help her. So she was just obviously influenced by her parents to act the way that she did, and she had no guidance to tell her how not to behave. So it's absolutely heartbreaking that Mary had literally no one who seemed to love and care about her. She didn't have any friends because she was considered to be a bully at the time. And in the community that she grew up in, violence was considered the norm and everyone was just used to it. There were murders, rapes, there were drunks, there was druggies, there were homeless people just everywhere in the streets. And next door to Mary Bell lived a little girl. And this was Mary Bell's only friend. And her name was Norma Bell, which they're not related. They just happen to have the same last name. So she was 2 years older than Mary, and she was 13 years old. And Norma was said to have not been very intelligent. Mary was a lot more intelligent compared to her. So Mary was able to control her through words and actions. So most of the children ended up learning to fear Mary and Norma. So they would terrorize the other children on the playground and make them terrified to, live life, essentially. So there was actually said to be some children who were so scared of Norma and Mary that they refused to even go to school anymore. They were just too scared that they were going to get attacked by them. So on Saturday, May 11th of 1968, Mary and Norma were just walking around, living their best life, I guess. I don't know what they were doing back then. It was the 60s. And they stumbled upon this 3-year-old boy who was outside playing by himself in the street. Again, this was back in the day where children were allowed to play by themselves, and no one really thought anything of it. No one thought that anything bad was going to happen. And I know we've talked about this over and over and over again, like a little 2-year-old by themselves or a 5-year-old by themselves. But like I said, this was back then when this type of stuff didn't really happen. So this was considered safe. Parents would check out on their children, or they'll see their little 3-year-old son playing with a whole bunch of older kids and they just assume that everything was okay. So the girls, they make their way over to this 3-year-old little boy and they begin to lure him away by promising to buy him candy and toys. Sometime later, this little boy was found crying and screaming on the side of the road with a giant gash in his head, and he was just bleeding profusely. So one bystander called an ambulance because the child was just very confused, seemed like they may have had a concussion, but nothing was ever done about this, and no one was charged with what happened to him. They just said it was a freak accident. So the following day, a mother of a local girl started complaining to police that Mary Bell had tried to violently strangle her daughter. However, despite these claims to authorities, no one did anything. No one did anything. They were just like, oh, so she tried to strangle your daughter? Oh, okay, never mind. It's fine. It's just like there's so many times where this could have been avoided. This entire video could have been avoided if police would have just listened. So when it came to Mary and Norma, they became the biggest bullies on the school playground, with Norma pinning down the girls. And one in particular named Pauline, Norma would pin her down and Mary would actually pry open her mouth and stuff it full of sand and causing them to choke, essentially. So once Mary did this, Norma just freaked the fuck out. She was like, oh hell no, this girl is just crazy, and she took off running like a bat out of hell. So she once she got off of Pauline and took off running, Pauline was able to make her way back home because Mary wasn't trying to do anything to stop her. So after this occurred, Pauline's parents called the authorities, but unfortunately, just like before, nothing ever came from this. 2 weeks after this occurrence, on Saturday, May 25th of 1968, there was a 4-year-old little boy, and he was just outside walking by himself, and his name was Martin Brown. He was just playing in the streets of Scotswood, England. He was described as being pretty tall for his age, with beautiful curly blonde hair and wide blue eyes. So he was kind of like a cherub in the way, you know what I'm talking about, like the Valentine's Day little babies with the cute little... Well, you guys know what I'm talking about, like the Roman statues and everything. So Martin was said to be very mischievous, and he was always getting into trouble and loved to play pranks on people. Like at 4 years old, he loved to play pranks. So there was a time, according to Martin's mother, that he decided that he wanted to have a swimming pool. So instead of, going up and saying, "Hey, Mommy, can I have a swimming pool?" he locked the bathroom door and completely flooded it not his bathroom door, his bedroom door, and he completely flooded the bottom drawer of his dresser, and his room was just completely flooded because he wanted to make a swimming pool. At first, the Brown family, they were said to not be very concerned in the slightest about Martin not returning home on time, but they assumed that he had just been playing and just lost track of time. I mean, it's understandable because, I remember being really young, going out and hanging out with my friends, I would lose track of time as well. So, it kind of does make sense, So they waited just a few minutes longer. However, by 5 p.m., Martin was still not home, and this completely worried the family because he had been out like all day. No one knew why he wasn't home yet. So his mother decided they were going to call the police, but before they had a chance to, they got a call from one of their neighbors, and this neighbor seemed extremely concerned and alarmed. They kept saying that Martin had been in an accident. They wouldn't specify what type of accident, they just kept saying Martin was injured and he was in an accident. So the parents, they obviously, packed everything up, went into the car, made their way over to where Martin was said to have been in this accident, and there was actually said to have been a crowd just gathering around Martin. And when his mother reached him, she was horrified to find out that he was just gray and stone cold. She removed her coat and placed it over top of him in hopes that it would keep him warm until an ambulance arrived, which placed Martin inside of the ambulance before taking off towards the Newcastle hospital. Unfortunately, once the ambulance arrived at the hospital, Martin was considered DOA, which stands for dead on arrival. His mother was absolutely just devastated by the loss of her young son because that was her only child, and she was just torn up because he was 4 years old, he was just a happy little boy, and now his life had been senselessly taken from him. Because Martin's body had been discovered under mysterious circumstances, police were called in to investigate. At first, when authorities arrived at the scene, they believed that Martin's cause of death had possibly been from him swallowing a whole bunch of medication. This was because the detectives, whenever they went into the home that Martin had been found at, they saw a whole bunch of tablets just all over the floor, and they assumed, he may have ingested them. This could have caused him to possibly, have a little overdose, and he could have choked on his own vomit and died. However, there was a pathologist at the scene of the crime, and he was able to perform a thorough examination of the little boy's throat to determine whether or not he had truly ingested these medications that everyone was saying that he had. So, unfortunately, the pathologist was unable to determine whether or not he had swallowed these pills, but there was no evidence in his throat of there being any type of pill residue. He couldn't have chewed it up, It just didn't seem like he had swallowed any pills. So there were a few theories as to what the authorities believed could have happened to Martin, and they believed that, one, he could have climbed up somewhere, just fallen down the steps, and suffered a broken neck and died from his injuries. or he could have died of fright, which basically, he got scared of something and had a heart attack and died. So they believed that, or that he could have starved to death. He could have, been out all day, hadn't eaten, and then just died. But the last one kind of doesn't make any sense to me because he didn't seem like he was too skinny from the pictures I saw. The authorities then started to make little articles about what happened to Martin, and then when they were writing these articles, they referred to him as a rat, which is just absolutely disgusting to call a small child that just died. Like, you're calling him a rat. It's just, it's just so disgusting. I don't understand how people could do that. So on Monday, May 27th of 1968, police were called to a Scotswood nursery close to where Mary Bell and Norma Bell lived at. There was a reported break-in, and the officers were called to search the scene. And when they were searching the scene, they ended up finding these really weird, suspicious pieces of paper. And the officers, they were obviously very curious as to what these papers could be. So they decided to obviously read them. So one read on one piece, it's quoted, "I murder so that I may come back." And then on another one it said, "We murder, watch out." And on a third it said, "We did murder Martin Brown." So it's just out there, man. They're just spitting what they just did. So these notes were said to have been scrawled in childish handwriting and were signed by Mary and Norma. So when the authorities found this, the notes were completely dismissed as being just a childish prank, which made me so mad because it's just like they were literally confessing it, and then they're like, "Oh, it was just a child." Okay. So that same Monday, Mary Bell was said to have arrived at her school that day as normal, and teachers noticed that there was just something about her. Like, she was just scribbling in her journal that she had just nonstop all day. She wasn't paying attention to her lessons, and this was kind of suspicious because no one knew, like, why she was writing there and what she was writing. So she had written in her journal, "A boy just laid down and died." That's literally what she wrote. "A boy just laid down and died." And on top of that, she drew a picture of Martin Brown's deceased body. Next to his body, she actually drew some tablets and labeled it as tablet, along with drawing a workman finding the body, which a workman did find the body. However, no one even noticed these disturbing pictures for 8 whole weeks, which is just crazy to me because she drew these pictures at school. You would think that the teacher would stop and be like, "What are you drawing?" Look at the pictures and be like, "Oh, Mary, there's something a little off there." But no one noticed. It just blows my mind. So Mary and Norma were said to have traveled together to Martin's aunt's house, which is who used to babysit, they used to babysit her young children. So they were familiar with Martin's aunt. So while they were over there, both girls would ask Martin's mother, who was over there visiting, how he felt about her son's death. And obviously she was just upset, and she thought that the girls were just asking, how she was coping with it, because, it has to be really hard to lose a child. But she genuinely thought that they were curious about how she was doing. So she answered, "My son is dead. I'm devastated. It's so sad." So she said, "Thank you for coming in and asking about him. I appreciate it. I appreciate you coming to check in on me." And this was when the girls then asked the mother if they could see Martin. And they're like, "Martin's dead. Martin's deceased. He's not here with us." And that's when Mary, she replied, "Oh, yeah, I know he's deceased. I just want to see his body." Like, what the fuck? She wanted to see him in his coffin. Like, she literally, who goes up and asks people, "Hey, I know your son just died, but can I see his body? I'm just curious to see what he looks like." Maybe, it could have been morbid curiosity, but I don't know. That just seems really weird. So his mother was obviously like super upset that this girl would come over and be like, "Can I see your deceased son?" So she told Mary basically to piss off and slammed the door in her face and locked it. So she saw her husband and she said, "Fetch a doctor," before passing out. Like, wow. So 2 long, grueling months passed by with no information as to who possibly could have done this to little Martin. And despite 2 months going by, his murder was not forgotten about in the community. It was talked about a lot. And according to local reports about Martin's death, it was ultimately blamed for, his death was blamed on the rat alley slums that they lived in. And this was because of how trashy and crime-riddled the area was. The Newcastle area was said to have been absolutely horrified and shocked to hear about Martin's death because he was just so young and innocent. I mean, who literally could have done something like this? Who could have gone and found the child and thought this was a very perfect opportunity to kill him? Like, I mean, no one goes out. They felt like they lived in a safe neighborhood, and no one knew why anyone would do something like this. What was even more heartbreaking was that this murder was said to have occurred in a very dangerous area because a lot of the city was under construction. So a lot of the kids would play in the buildings and stuff that were under construction, just go there to have a good time. And while he was playing, something could have happened to him, or he was lured there with the promises of, "Hey, we're just gonna play a game," and then was murdered. Like, it's just so sad. So the construction workers, they ultimately felt like a lot of guilt about what happened to Martin because they assumed that if they hadn't been working, they might have been able to stop his death from happening. In the front of the march that was held for, Martin's death, there was a young girl who was carrying a flag, and this girl was no one other than Mary Bell herself. There was a young killer at large, and it was going completely unnoticed by the community at this time because the killer of Martin had never been caught, and another death would soon become inevitable because the killer was never caught. So, on Wednesday, July 31st of 1968, a 3-year-old little boy named Brian Howe was outside playing by himself. There's a lot of kids out here playing by themselves at the ages of 3. I don't understand. So he was completely unsupervised by his parents out in the slum streets. So he wasn't even in like his yard or anything. He was in the slum streets. It's like walking around in downtown Baltimore or downtown Honolulu and you're 3 years old by yourself. Like, no, I don't know. Maybe it was just a different time. I certainly wouldn't. So Brian's folks, they just assumed that the older children that were outside playing would watch over him and make sure everything's okay. But again, you never assume things because it just makes an ass out of you and me. That's what I always say. So while he was playing, he curiously made his way over to the rat alley because he wanted to watch the demolition of the derelict houses. A little while later, Mary Bell and Norma, they notice young Brian out by himself and think that he might need a friend. So they decide to walk over and say, "Hi, I'm Mary. Hi, I'm Norma. What's your name?" He says, "Brian." So Mary decides to pick him up because he's a toddler, he's 3, and they carry him like on her hip out of the area that he was in, and they carry him towards this local Tin Lizzie playground because they said that they were going to play with him. Unfortunately, after this sighting, technically it was an abduction, after this abduction, Brian was never seen alive again. So when Brian Howe never returned home from playing that day, his parents were just consumed with worry about something possibly happening to him, and they alerted the authorities immediately. A lot of people started to hear about this little boy's abduction, but no one started connecting the dots that it could have been Mary Bell. The locals had just assumed that he had been lured away by a child predator or could have just gotten lost and couldn't find his way back home, which, I mean, the getting lost part could possibly happen. So later that evening, dozens of police cars surround his home and then make their way over to the Tin Lizzie playground once they find out that he was last seen over there playing. As they enter inside, the police are horrified to find the body of 3-year-old Brian Howe inside the playground. So Brian had also been violently murdered. So this is 2 kids that were 3 or 4 years old and just gone. The area was then subsequently blocked off, and this was able to allow the authorities to examine the body of the little boy to see what could have killed him. There was a chief of police in the area at the time. His name was Harvey Burroughs, and he was officially put in charge of the investigation. He noticed that Brian's deceased body was found completely stripped nude and was tossed onto the concrete like a rag doll. Pieces of his blonde hair had been hacked off, and laid next to him, along with puncture wounds that were found in his legs of this poor little boy. Authorities believe that the same scissors that were used to stab this little boy in his legs had been used to literally just cut his hair. So these wounds must have been caused after Brian's death. It's possible they cut his hair, but then he died after his hair was cut, and then after he died, they stabbed him with whatever, the scissors and everything. So it was then established that his killer had to have been someone who was young, because of how the killing was gentle and wasn't like he wasn't raped or anything. So they just assumed at the time it was a young child. So it was then established, that the official post-mortem report claimed that Brian Howe's cause of death was because he was violently strangled to death, and the stab marks police saw were actually failed attempts to leave the killer's initials in the body. So they attempted to carve their name in there like he was a pumpkin, and it didn't work. So because of this, it was said that this homicide had been conducted by a young child, and after this murder had occurred, it allowed the murder case of Martin Brown to be reopened. At this moment, authorities traveled to his home, and they told his mother, "Sit down, we've got something to tell you." And this is when the authorities announced that they've reopened the case, and it was officially a murder investigation. For the horror and shock of the local community, authorities announced to the public that they were searching for a child as the main suspect behind both murders. The community was just shocked because they could not believe that a child could do such a brutal crime such as these. However, there was one child that actually really stuck out to authorities at the time, and this child's name was Mary Bell, because she seemed like she wanted some attention. She would often arrive at these press conferences about the killings, and she would push her way through the crowd, maneuver her way to the front, and she would stand there and look at them with these piercing eyes. However, the local children already knew that Mary and Norma were these huge troublemakers in the area. Mary would often boast to other students at the school how she was the one behind the murders and how she strangled a young boy to death. Many students would often get assaulted and abused by Mary on the daily on the playground, and everyone who would go to school with her ended up knowing quickly about her erratic behavior. After an official press conference, authorities decided they were going to try to speak with Mary Bell. When they arrived at her home, however, her father, named Billy, opened the door and refused to let them inside their house or speak to his daughter because she was 11 years old, and he didn't want the police coming into his house in the first place. It's very protective. So he then threatened to let out their dog, and he said that this dog was going to come and viciously attack them if they wouldn't go, so unfortunately they did have to leave. There was a witness to the murder of Brian Howe, and this boy was said to have been 9 years old, and he was developmentally delayed. He had seen everything that Mary had done to Brian, and then began to explain her killing methods. I'm using quotations because that was literally what he said. Her killing methods to these children. She would basically massage her young victims' necks and tell them that they had a sore throat and that she was going to make it better for them. And then as she was massaging their throats, she would begin to tighten her grip and tighten and tighten and tighten it until she strangled these poor boys to death. Harvey Burroughs ordered police to go to the Scottswood area and bring in both Norma and Mary for questioning. Along with this, authorities brought in a psychiatrist to examine the girls and provide them pictures of both boys. Upon looking at them, the authorities realized that they had no remorse for their crimes, and Mary actually denied being involved in these killings or murdering anyone in general. Instead, all she talked about was about her friendship with Norma and her dog, and brought up how both girls were just very happy that day, and it was one of the best days of their lives, and this day was the day that they had killed Brian, so it's a little weird. Yeah, the best day of my life is when I killed a little boy. Like, it's just weird to me. Later that evening, Mary and Norma were taken into care at Newcastle, England. A lot of people in the area who knew Mary personally, they did not believe that she could do something like this. So Mary was said to be extremely intelligent and just vivacious, just full of life. She had a very charming personality, and she was just a precious little girl all around. She had these big eyes that could just captivate a soul. She could look at someone, and it made them feel like she was literally looking into them. So a lot of the public actually felt really bad for Mary, and this was because she was 11 years old and being accused of murder. I mean, she was just a pretty little girl. She was 11. She was getting charged with murder. No one understood why they were going after this little girl. So because of the young ages of the girls, it seemed like they truly didn't understand what was going on and what they had just gotten themselves into. When Mary was ultimately questioned, police were astonished by her answers, and according to a documentary made about this case during the 1990s, the authorities called it computer brain. When asked a question, Mary would answer it before it was fully asked, and she would even answer questions that haven't even been asked. So she would say that she was reading their minds, or she knew what they were going to say, and it's just really weird to me. Despite her denial about being involved with the murders, the evidence against Mary began to build, including the scissors that were found at Brian Howe's murder scene. The scissors belonged to Mary, and she had used them that day for school. The police then began to connect the dots between Mary and these notes, discovering even more evidence at her school. So there was a teacher that she had. His name was Eric Foster, and Eric was said to be very fond of Mary, thought she was a beautiful little girl. She was highly intelligent, and he was actually impressed by her intelligence at such a young age. So he was stunned to find out about her arrest, and he said to authorities that he would do anything he could to see if something that she could have written or drawn in class could contribute to their case. So he was stunned, and he was looking through her schoolwork. It was at this moment that he actually found her school book, and Mary had written on the cover, "Boy found dead in old house." And inside her book was the official newspaper reports about Brian Howe's murder. So these drawings from inside her book that she had also, added with the cover of this newspaper article, these drawings were said to have been stuff that was not released to the public, and this meant that Mary had either been at the crime scene herself, or she was the one behind the murders. On August 8th of 1968, the police formally charged 11-year-old Mary Bell and her 13-year-old friend Norma Bell with Brian Howe's murder. On December 5th of 1968, almost 4 months later after the murders, Mary's trial was set to begin. When each girl went to the stand, they claimed that they were innocent, and they actually started to blame each other for being behind the murders. So Mary would say it was Norma, Norma would say it was Mary, and then at one point they both denied even knowing each other or even knowing the kids, doing such a thing, and that it was all just made up. So, because of their young ages, both girls were said to have been unable to properly respond to the situation, and the judges had to allow their lawyers to sit with their clients because they kept panicking and having panic attacks. When asked about the murders, Mary showed no remorse and no emotion, and in fact, the only time that she was said to have gotten upset during the trial was when the prosecution brought up the fact that she had attempted to strangle a pigeon to death. This caused Mary to cry and cry to the point where she actually needed to leave the courthouse, and the trial needed to be paused for her to be ordered, in order for her to calm down. So the trial ultimately lasted 9 long days, and as the time passed, it became obvious to the courts at this point that Mary wasn't quite right psychologically. She was missing something in her emotions that made her act in a very sadistic way. As for Norma, she was said to have been not right intellectually, meaning that she wasn't on the same, level of intelligence as Mary was. So it's possible that she could have just went along with whatever Mary said and wanted them to do. There was no doubt in the court's minds that Mary had viciously strangled these poor little boys to death. There were some doctors who interviewed her, and they believed her to be a legit undiagnosed psychopath. And she didn't feel any remorse for any of her crimes, and this is one of the signs of being a psychopath. Mary was very highly intelligent, and she was just fascinated with death to the point that she wanted to kill as many children as she could. She was so fascinated by it that she wanted to do it herself. I mean, it's quite possible that she could have grown up, like if she wasn't caught or anything, she could have grown up to become a female serial killer, like Eileen, Wamos? I think is how you pronounce her last name, but you know who I'm talking about. And like I said, had she not been caught, she could become a serial killer and killed all these little kids. Mary was ultimately charged with manslaughter and found guilty, and Norma was simply acquitted because the courts deemed her too simple-minded to be able to do something like this. So because they thought that she was simple-minded, they just threw her trial out the window. She was dismissed from court and was allowed to go back with her family while Mary was sentenced to Her Majesty's Palace. She was in great shock by her sentencing, and Martin's mother was just pissed because she truly believed that Mary should be in prison and not in Her Majesty's Palace. Her Majesty's Pleasure, sorry. Mary Bell was then ultimately sent to Red Bank in Lancashire, England. So this was like after she was at Her Majesty's Pleasure. So she ended up going to this school called Red Bank, and it was a secure school for young juvenile delinquents who were in trouble with the law. She was then looked after while she was living here and was given the attention that she so longingly craved, and she never really got as a child growing up. So while staying there, Mary proved to be extremely and highly intelligent. Authorities wanted to know why an 11-year-old little girl had killed these innocent little boys for seemingly no reason. And when the local community found out about what she had done, they felt really sympathetic towards her actions and her behaviors, and they started blaming everything that she had done on the fact that she lived in such a crime-riddled community. So it was said when people looked into her enormous blue eyes that she had, they saw fear and not psychosis. So they really felt sorry for her. They just saw that she was terrified. She didn't like who she was. She didn't like the way that she was growing up. She wanted to know why she was acting the way that she was, because she seemed like she couldn't help it and she was scared of who she was. So Mary's mother was said to have frequently visited her while she was living at Red Bank, and this really upset them because they had this really strong hatred for one another. Because Mary's mother hated her so much, remember, Mary's mother hated her because she didn't want to be a mother in the first place, it's possible that this could have caused her to become a vicious killer because people get neglected, they pent up all this anger, and they take the anger out on other people. While she was living in Red Bank, she sent her mother a letter that blamed her essentially for ruining her life, and this had to be just excruciatingly painful for Betty to receive. I mean, imagine getting a letter from your own child saying, yeah, I know I'm over here in prison, I have to spend my rest of my life here, but it's because of you, and you really didn't do anything except raise them. In 1972, Betty Bell did a television interview, and she claimed that something must have happened for Mary to kill. Something must have happened psychologically, something must have happened in her life. So Mary Bell spent 12 years in prison for her crimes, with 6 of them actually being in Red Bank. While staying at Red Bank, it is said that she was the only female there, and she was treated by the in-house therapist quite often to see why Mary would do what she did. So, as they were asking her why you did this, Mary just refused to take responsibility for her actions. She kept saying, I don't know what you're talking about, I never did this, you know, it wasn't me, it was Norma, I don't know why you're pinning everything on me. And she claims she wasn't even involved in any of the murders. She just happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time. It just seems so wishy-washy at this point. As Mary Bell grew up, it was said that she no longer posed a threat to society. So in the year of 1978, Mary was then transferred to Asking Prison and was released from prison at the age of 23. After her release, she decided to create a whole new identity to protect herself and moved out of town so that she could just escape her past the best that she could. So for the community of Scottsville, they just could not move past Mary Bell's violent acts. And instead of children growing up with innocence, it became more crime-ridden. Because of the fact that she had killed these kids, now there's more crime going on, it just seemed like it was not getting anywhere. The fact that she had killed was because a lot of people thought it was because of how dangerous the area was, but the area is still dangerous now. So it just really upset everyone, and it felt like to the community that this town was a failure to society because it produced children who became vicious killers. Now, I did do my research. I couldn't find if anyone else living in that area did become a sadistic killer like Mary Bell, but it is possible someone else could have been raised there, moved somewhere else, and, you know, killed. I'm not 100% sure on all of that. So, I would love to know what you guys think. Do you guys think that Mary Bell was a sadistic killer, or do you think that she was just a product of the environment that she lived in? I personally believe that Mary did, in fact, have a psychopathic disorder, and her living in that environment probably triggered it more and more and caused her to do more vicious things. And the fact that she possibly, no one really noticed it, and no one told of any doctors, she wasn't on any type of medication. So a lot of this stuff got overlooked, and she ended up getting fueled into this murderous rampage where she took out all of her anger on these poor little children. And she should have gotten help like a long time ago. I mean, I know I seem kind of sympathetic and everything, but seriously, she should have gotten help a long time ago. Otherwise, you know, this whole thing wouldn't have happened. But back in the 1960s and everything, mental health was frowned upon, and if you had a child, or if you were someone who was in a mental institution, especially if you were a parent and you had a child in a mental institution, you were thought of in society as a bad parent and a failure. So that could have been one of the reasons why Mary Bell never went to a mental institution. That and her mother was always a prostitute, was probably never home, never even realized that this was going on with her. So, I mean, I don't know. I just would love to know what you guys think down below in the comment section. Do you guys think that she was a sadistic killer? Do you guys think that maybe she was a product of her environment? What do you guys think about this one? Make sure you like this video and hit that subscribe button. Turn on that notification bell comment down below your thoughts and opinions on this video. And I hope to see you guys in my next one. I know this has been just a long case, grueling case. Like, it blows my mind just how crazy this case really is. I mean, it's an 11-year-old girl who went out and killed a bunch of little kids. Like, wow. And the fact that she had a friend that watched her stuff sand down this kid's throat to make them choke. Like, I feel like there were so many signs that she was not okay, but no one really did anything about it. Like, it blows my mind. So again, I'd like to know what you guys think about it down below in the comments section. Add any recommendations for any type of cases you want me to cover next, and I'll be seeing you guys in my next video. Bye, guys.